The wind out in the Dragoon foothills didn't carry words, only silence, dust, and ghosts. Elijah Creed had long since stopped listening for anything else. At 43, he'd worn the years like a saddle wears the back of a Mustang, with weight, purpose, and the shape of old pain pressed into every inch. He lived alone in a squat adobe house at the edge of a dying ranch, a place so forgotten it didn't even show up on most maps. That was just fine with Elijah. He didn't want to be found. He'd once had a family, a wife named Clara who smelled of juniper and sang to the moon when she thought he wasn't listening, and a boy, Nathaniel, who'd made a small leather totem shaped like a bird and insisted Elijah keep it on his saddle horn for good luck. That bird was now buried under a cottonwood tree near the east fence, along with all the words Elijah no longer had the courage to say. 10 years had passed since Clara and Nathaniel were killed. The details didn't matter much anymore, only that the settlers blamed the Apache, and the Apache blamed the settlers, and Elijah blamed himself. Since that day, he'd retreated into the dust, a man carved from regret, seeking neither justice nor revenge, just quiet. He rose before dawn and worked past sundown, tending to a dozen head of cattle and a stubborn mule named Jonah. He fixed his own fences, cooked his own beans, and drank only enough whiskey to sleep without dreaming. The folks in Agua Prieta called him the Shadow Man. He hadn't stepped into town in over a year. No one came looking, and he sure as hell didn't go asking. That morning, the sun broke red over the Dragoon teeth, and Elijah saddled up without much thought. His mare, a dapple gray named Mercy, knew the route well. South fence line, then east past the dry creek, checking for gaps where cattle might have wandered. He rode with his hat low and his rifle slung, a man who'd seen enough of the world to no longer be surprised by it. Around midday, the buzzards found him. Not directly, but circling. A tight, hungry spiral over a cut in the earth, an arroyo he hadn't checked in weeks. He didn't much care for what buzzards meant, but years on the range taught him to respect what they said. Mercy snorted as they neared the edge. Elijah dismounted slowly, rifle in hand. The heat was already brutal, shimmering off the rocks like a mirage. He walked the last few yards and stopped cold. 2 bodies. Apache men, sprawled across the ravine floor like discarded dolls. Their tunics were blood-soaked, limbs bent at unnatural angles. But it wasn't the death that gave Elijah pause. It was the arrows still lodged in their backs. Apache arrows. He squatted beside the nearest corpse and traced the fletching. Elk hide, hawk feather, twisted sinew. Not cowboy work. This was tribal. An execution, not a raid. He should have walked away. That was the rule. You don't touch Apache dead, and you don't get involved in Apache business. Jedediah Stone had beaten that lesson into every ranch hand he ever hired. A white man meddling in Apache affairs ends up with his scalp tied to a lance. Elijah had seen enough to know it wasn't just fear-mongering. He turned to go. One step, then another, and then he heard it. A sound so faint it might have been the wind. But then it came again. A moan, low and ragged, like a dying breath caught in the throat of the desert. Elijah froze. He scanned the ravine, heart thudding against ribs that hadn't known panic in years. There, beneath a sun-bleached overhang, half hidden in shadow and blood, a figure, smaller, slighter, still breathing. Elijah approached slowly, rifle raised, every instinct yelling at him to turn around. The shape under the rock didn't move, just breathed, shallow and uneven. He stepped closer. It wasn't a man. It was a girl. Apache, no more than 20.
Her skin was the rich brown of sun and earth, streaked with dried blood and dust. Her black hair hung in tangled ropes across her face. A jagged arrow protruded from her side, low under the ribs. Her chest barely rose with each breath, but she was alive. Elijah stood over her, rifle still gripped tight. He'd heard the stories all his life, how Apache women were as fierce as the men, how they carried hidden knives and poison. But this girl wasn't fierce. She was broken. His finger hovered over the trigger. The right thing, the safe thing, was to end it. One shot, clean. Better than letting the desert eat her alive. It wouldn't be cruelty. It would be mercy. She was the enemy. At least that's what the world had taught him. But then something shifted. As he crouched, her head lolled to the side, and something slipped from around her neck. A worn strip of leather looped around a small carved object. A bird, wings spread wide. Elijah's breath caught. It was almost identical to the one Nathaniel had made for him. A crude little totem shaped like a hawk, whittled from juniper and tied with a scrap of blue cloth. Elijah had kept it for years after the boy died, until one windstorm too many had carried it off his saddle horn and into the rocks. Now, here it was again. No, not the same, but close enough to raise ghosts. His hand trembled as he reached for it. The leather was slick with her blood. His mind drifted, unbidden, to Clara's voice, gentle and fierce at once. Don't let another child die in your silence. He stared at the girl's face, round, delicate beneath the dirt, framed by lashes wet with sweat. Her lips were cracked, her breath rattled, and just like that, something inside him broke loose. He lowered the rifle, slung it back over his shoulder. With steady hands, he snapped the arrow's shaft and rolled her gently onto her side. She groaned but didn't wake. He tore a strip from his own shirt and pressed it to the wound, trying to slow the bleeding. It wasn't enough. He needed water, shelter, time. Hell, he muttered. What are you doing, Creed? He glanced up.
Mercy waited at the edge of the ravine, ears twitching. Elijah hefted the girl into his arms, surprised at how light she was. Bone and muscle, nothing more. She didn't stir as he climbed the incline, each step a protest in his knees and back. When he reached the horse, Mercy shied at the smell of blood. "Easy, girl," Elijah whispered. "She ain't gonna hurt you." It took some coaxing, but he finally got the girl draped belly down over the saddle. Then he mounted behind her, adjusting her weight against his chest, one arm wrapped tight around her to keep her steady. He cast one last look back at the ravine. The two bodies, the buzzards circling lower, the blood already baking black in the sun. This was madness. But he turned Mercy's head toward the mountains anyway, not back toward the ranch, not toward town. Northwest, into the rocks, into the unknown. Each hoofbeat echoed like a decision he couldn't take back. The ride into the Dragoon foothills was a blur of heat, dust, and tightening doubt. Elijah didn't know where he was going, only where he couldn't go. Not back to the ranch, not toward Agua Prieta. He needed a place out of sight, out of mind. A crease in the earth where no lawman, no Apache scout, and no ghost could find them. He found it near dusk, a narrow cut between two granite spines, half choked with mesquite and palo verde. There was a seep spring at the base, barely more than a wet trickle, but the water pooled just enough in a shallow basin of rock to matter. Enough to live, if only for a while. He slid from the saddle, bones groaning as he lowered the unconscious girl. Her skin was burning up now, her breath shallow and ragged. The bandage he'd wrapped was soaked through, dark and sticky. She needed more than rest. She needed medicine. But the nearest doctor was days away, and Elijah didn't have days. "Damn it, girl," he muttered, brushing her matted hair from her forehead.
"Why'd you have to still be breathin'?" He laid her on his saddle blanket, folding it under her head.
Then he stripped off his gloves, cupped his hands, and gathered what water he could. With his old red kerchief, he dabbed the sweat and blood from her face. Her lips were cracked. He wrung a few drops of water into her mouth. Her throat worked, swallowing instinctively, but her eyes didn't open. Elijah worked through twilight. He gathered dry grass and tinder, built a smokeless fire from mesquite bark, and set a small tin pot over it to boil what little water he'd gathered. As the shadows thickened, the high desert began to cool. He chewed a plug of jerky without tasting it, and kept one hand near the rifle propped against the rock. When night fully fell, the sky exploded into a sea of stars. Elijah stared at them with the same blank distance he gave most things now. Somewhere out there, Clara and Nathaniel had a corner of the heavens. He used to talk to them, used to think they talked back. These days, silence answered silence. The girl moaned just past midnight, twisted, restless. Fever was taking her fast. Elijah knelt beside her and peeled back the crude bandage. The wound was ugly now, red and swollen, the flesh hot and angry. He knew enough to recognize infection, knew it could spread. He thought about cutting it open, draining it like he'd done with abscesses in sick cattle. But this wasn't cattle. This was a girl barely hanging on. He closed his eyes, reached into the canvas bag beneath the saddle, pulled out a small leather pouch, worn and soft. Clara's medicine kit. He hadn't opened it in years. Inside were dried herbs, ground roots, handwritten notes he hadn't dared throw away. He found the one she'd called burn leaf, an astringent she swore by. Boiled it in the tin, mixed with whiskey from his flask, and let it steep. He cleaned the wound again, careful and slow, whispering apologies she couldn't hear. She winced, even unconscious. But the bleeding slowed. He packed it with salve and pressed clean cloth against it, bound it tight with twine. Then he sat and waited and listened. And when a coyote howled far in the hills and the wind shifted just so, he heard it. Hoofbeats, distant, measured, coming from the east. He was on his feet in a flash, snatching up the rifle and snuffing the fire. His heart slammed in his chest. The girl still lay unconscious, defenseless. No time to move her, no time to flee. He crouched low behind the rocks, rifle barrel steady. The hoofbeats grew louder, then fainter, then disappeared entirely. He stayed frozen for a long time, every sense stretched taut. Nothing came. But the message had been delivered. They were being hunted. Dawn broke hard and colorless over the canyon, painting the sky in cold steel and ash. Elijah had barely slept. His back ached from leaning against the stone wall all night, and his rifle sat across his lap like a restless dog. He hadn't heard the hoofbeats again, but that didn't mean they weren't still out there, circling, listening, waiting. The girl stirred just as the sun kissed the far ridge. At first it was just a twitch in her fingers, a shallow hitch in her breath. Then her eyes fluttered open, dark and wary, like a deer too wounded to bolt. She tried to sit up and gasped in pain, clutching her side. "Easy," Elijah said, crouching beside her. "You move too quick, that arrow wound'll open right back up." She blinked at him, confused. Her lips moved, but no sound came. He handed her the canteen. She drank greedily, spilling half of it down her chin. When she was done, her gaze lingered on him, confused and guarded. "You remember what happened?" Elijah asked, settling back on his heels. Her eyes narrowed. Then she nodded. Barely. "You were left for dead," he said softly. "Out in the arroyo. 2 others, Apache, didn't make it. One of them had your blood on his knife." Something in her face hardened at that. Her jaw set.
"What's your name?" Elijah asked after a beat. The girl hesitated. "Takana," she whispered, voice raw. Elijah repeated it softly, letting it settle. "Takana." He waited. She said nothing more. "You got family nearby? Someone who's going to come looking for you?" Again, a long silence. Then, "No, not anymore." There was weight in those 3 words, too much for someone her age to carry. Elijah frowned. What happened? Takana's gaze drifted toward the fire pit, now cold ash and stone. "My cousin," she said, voice hoarse. "Kalen. He leads a splinter band of the Chokanen. Says he fights for the old ways, for war." Elijah didn't speak. He just listened. "He wants the seat of my father, Toganai, the war chief," she continued, eyes still fixed on the dust. "But the elders favor me, not for war, for peace. My father taught me to speak with the white world, to negotiate." She looked up at Elijah now, her eyes sharp despite the weakness in her limbs. "Kalen says peace is weakness, that I am weakness." Elijah exhaled, a long, slow breath. The pieces clicked into place. "You're not just someone's daughter," he said. "No," Takana whispered. "I am his only child." A tight silence followed. Elijah rubbed his jaw. "So you're not just hunted," he said finally. "You're a reason for a war to start." She didn't nod, but she didn't deny it. A dry wind rustled the mesquite leaves overhead. The sky was brightening now, the shadows thinning. Elijah felt the pressure of the day already building, the weight of choices, of blood spilled and blood to come. He looked at her again. Takana, daughter of a war chief, bleeding in his camp with a price on her head. He should have felt fear, regret, but what he felt was anger. Not at her, not even at her cousin. At the fact that the world couldn't leave a girl like her alone to live. "You're safe here," he said, standing slowly. "For now." Takana watched him with eyes like flint. "No one is safe, not while Kalen breathes." Elijah didn't argue. He just looked out at the horizon and wondered how long they had left before that man came knocking. By the second evening, Takana's fever had worsened. Her body shook with chills even as her skin burned like fire. Elijah had done what he could, herbs, cool compresses, Clara's old salves, but nothing held back the red bloom of infection crawling up her side. It was past the point of hope. She needed real medicine, a doctor, and the only one within reach was in Agua Prieta. It was a bad idea. Worse than bad, it was near suicidal. The town was a magnet for drifters, bounty hunters, and worse. If even a whisper of Takana's identity leaked, she'd be lucky to make it out with her scalp still attached. And Elijah riding in with an Apache girl in his arms, they'd string him up for treason without bothering to ask questions. Still, as he watched her curled in pain, breath shallow, he knew there was no choice. She'd die before sunrise without help. "I need you to trust me," he said the next morning, crouching beside her. "We're going into town." Her eyes fluttered open, fever-glazed but sharp underneath. "Town?" she rasped. "Dr. Finch. He's no saint, but he can clean wounds and sell snake oil better than most. If anyone can help you, it's him." "No," she said, panicked. "They'll know. They'll see me." "Not if we're careful," Elijah said. "You're light-skinned enough. We'll say you're my niece, part Mexican, ambushed by outlaws while traveling. It's a lie, sure, but it's better than a grave." She stared at him for a long moment, then nodded, barely. They rode out before sunrise, Takana bundled in one of Elijah's old shirts, her hair tucked beneath a faded slouch hat. She swayed in the saddle, barely conscious, but alive. Mercy carried them down through dry creek beds and winding game trails, avoiding the open flats. Every mile felt like walking a blade's edge. By noon, they saw it. Agua Prieta, a dirty row of buildings baking in the sun, framed by heat and desperation. A saloon, a blacksmith, a general store. And at the far end of the street, leaning like a drunk against time itself, a weathered adobe shack with a crooked sign, Dr. Alistair Finch, all maladies considered. Elijah dismounted, helped Takana down, keeping her head low. She clung to him, barely upright. He pushed open the doctor's door, the creak announcing them like a bell of doom. The inside smelled of alcohol, herbs, and old metal. Shelves buckled under the weight of dusty jars and rusted tools. In the middle of it all stood Dr. Finch, hunched, wiry, with white hair like straw, and spectacles that made his eyes bug out like a frog's. "Lord in heaven," Finch muttered, setting down a jar of leeches. "Elijah Creed, back from the grave. You bringing me trouble or salvation today?" "Bit of both," Elijah said, dragging Takana to the examination table. "She's hurt bad, arrow wound, needs cleaning, sealing, the works." Finch peered at the girl, then raised an eyebrow. "Apache?" Elijah's voice dropped an octave. "Half. Mother was Mexican. Doesn't matter. She needs help." Finch sniffed. Everything matters in this God-forsaken place. But he went to work anyway. As the doctor scrubbed and muttered, Elijah's eyes never left the door. Every creak on the porch, every hoofbeat outside, set his jaw tighter. He saw the faces peering in, drunks, opportunists, ranch hands looking for a story. And then he saw them. Across the street, leaning against the saloon rail, two men on horseback, watching the clinic with still eyes. One wore a bone necklace. The other had a rifle, cradled casually across his lap. Not townsfolk, Apache. But not Takana's kind. They didn't approach, didn't need to. They'd found her. Dr. Finch worked with a quiet urgency that betrayed years of experience and an equally long descent into disillusionment. His hands, though trembling at first, grew steady as he cleaned Takana's wound, trimmed the dead flesh, and packed the gash with a foul-smelling poultice that made her twitch even in unconsciousness. "She's lucky," Finch muttered without looking up. "Another day and her lungs would have followed the rot. Now she might live, but she'll need rest. No jostling, no riding." Elijah glanced through the grimy window again. The two Apache across the street were gone. That was worse than seeing them. "They're not gonna wait," Elijah said. "Not for her to heal, not for me to figure this out." Finch dabbed sweat from his brow. "Then you best think quick, Creed. I don't need your corpse on my porch." Elijah's mind spun. Options? There were none. Allies? Only one, and he was about done bandaging the last sliver of hope Elijah had left. Then something caught his eye, on the cluttered desk by the door. A pile of wanted posters. Some new, some ancient, most worthless. But one had a name that made Elijah's mouth go dry. A rustler from Sonora, dark hair, scar under his eye, wanted for a half-dozen killings, dead or alive. And he looked just enough like Takana in the right hat and lighting. A plan began to form. Risky, desperate, but better than waiting to be cornered. "You still got that back door through the smithy?" Elijah asked. Finch's eyes narrowed. "Maybe. Why?" "I need 5 minutes," Elijah said, "and a diversion loud enough to rattle the bones of this town." Finch sighed. "You always did ask for more than what was sane." Elijah gave a humorless smile. "Ain't that why you liked me?" Moments later, Finch stumbled out the front door, clutching the wanted poster and waving it like a preacher with a vision. He shouted something about a bounty, gesturing wildly toward the South Trail. Elijah, from the back, heard the commotion rise, doors swinging, boots thudding on wood, voices sharpening with greed. The town bit the bait like starving dogs. He didn't wait. He hoisted Takana, drowsy but conscious now, into his arms. "Hold on," he whispered. "We ain't done yet." He slipped through the rear door into the alley, the shadows thick and still, but not empty. A figure stepped from behind the forge, one of the Apache from before, rifle in hand, eyes like stone. They locked eyes. Time slowed. Then, crack!
A loud crash erupted from the saloon, gunfire, screams. Finch had started a brawl, maybe even fired a shot into the ceiling. The Apache hesitated, turning slightly. It was enough. Elijah slammed into him shoulder first, knocking the rifle wide. The man stumbled, and Elijah surged past with Takana clutched tight, running toward the horses tied behind the smithy. Another shape loomed, a second Apache, but before he could react, a revolver cracked once and the ground beside him exploded in dust. A third figure appeared, holding reins in one hand and a pistol in the other. Dr. Finch. "I figured you might need a head start," the old man barked. Elijah didn't hesitate. He threw Takana onto the nearest saddle, swung up behind her, and kicked the mare hard. Finch tossed him a satchel, medicine, supplies, and maybe a miracle or two. "Tell my brother in Tucson," Finch called after them, "he still owes me for that poker game in '68. Then he turned, raised his pistol again, and walked straight toward the alley as Elijah disappeared into the smoke and screaming behind him. They rode like devils chased them, and maybe they were. Behind them, Agua Prieta burned in chaos, but ahead the land opened wide and dark. Elijah didn't know where he was going, only that he was riding with a girl the world wanted dead and a promise unspoken between them. They were not done fighting. They rode hard for 2 days, moving by night and resting in dry washes by day. Takana, though weak, was no longer feverish. Dr. Finch's medicine had steadied her, and the wound had stopped seeping. She was healing, but Elijah knew healing was not the same as safe.
The terrain grew harsher as they moved west, the hills breaking into broad mesas and winding ravines. Elijah kept them off the main trails, tracking by stars and instinct. But even instincts grow thin when ghosts begin to stir. On the third day, as the sun broke above a rocky ridge, Elijah spotted them. Cattle. A small herd scattered across a dry meadow. The brand burned into their flanks froze the breath in his lungs. Circle J, Jedediah Stone's brand. Elijah cursed under his breath. In trying to avoid the men hunting Takana, he'd looped back too far. They were now riding along the western edge of Stone's range, a stretch of land guarded like a kingdom and ruled like one too. "We need to turn back," he muttered. But it was too late. Dust rose on the horizon. Riders, 5, maybe 6, moving fast, sweeping in a half circle to cut them off. Takana shifted in the saddle behind him. Trouble? Old trouble, Elijah said grimly. The riders fanned out as they closed in. At the head rode Jedediah Stone himself, tall in the saddle, white beard cut like steel wool, eyes sharp and cold as river ice. He reined in hard a few yards away. His gaze landed on Elijah, then dropped to Takana, her face shaded by the brim of her hat, her arm clutched protectively across her side. "Well, I'll be damned," Jedediah said, voice like gravel. "Elijah Creed, back from the dead and riding with a squaw on stolen land." Elijah didn't move, just passing through. Jedediah laughed, but there was no humor in it. The other men circled, rifles out but not raised, not yet. "You're passing through with one of them behind you, and through my land, no less?" Jedediah leaned forward. "And here I thought you'd learned your lesson when they took your boy." Elijah's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "Tell me, Creed," Stone went on, "what's the plan? Traitor for redemption? Or you finally gone full savage?" "She's wounded," Elijah said, "and she's not a threat." Jedediah's eyes narrowed. "You think that matters? You know the price on Apache hides these days?" Takana stiffened behind him, but Elijah kept still. Jedediah glanced at his men. "I should shoot you right here. Save the army the paperwork. Say you attacked us. Say you died like a damn fool." Elijah raised his voice, calm but cutting. "You do that, and you'll never know the truth about what happened 10 years ago." That stopped him. Jedediah stared, jaw tightening. "You want to blame me for Nathan's death?" Elijah said, voice low now. "Fine, but you knew the truth then, same as I do now. He wandered off chasing coyotes. I was the one who found his body. I buried him, not them." "You left the gate open," Jedediah roared, all pretense shattered. "I buried him," Elijah repeated, pain leaking through the cracks in his voice, "while you screamed at the sky and drank yourself blind." Silence, heavy and raw. Then Jedediah drew his pistol. "You take that Apache another step through my land, Creed, and I'll end this right now." Elijah didn't flinch, but Takana moved. Her voice was steady. "If you shoot him, you'll start a war." Stone's eyes flicked to her. She met his gaze. "My name is Takana, daughter of Toganai. You kill me here, and you'll hang for it, if the bullets don't find you first." Jedediah hesitated, then he spat into the dirt. "Get off my land before I change my mind." Elijah tipped his hat, keeping his eyes on Stone's men. "We're already gone." He turned Mercy, guiding her carefully around the rifles, the stairs, the loaded past. Takana rode straight-backed behind him, unflinching. Only when the mesa swallowed the last of Stone's land behind them did Elijah let out the breath he'd been holding. And in that breath was something old and sharp and almost forgotten. Peace. The Dragoon Mountains rose ahead like the bones of the world, jagged, eternal, and utterly indifferent. Elijah stared up at them as the last sliver of Jedediah Stone's land disappeared behind him. And in that breath was something old and sharp, and almost forgotten. Peace. The air grew cooler, the terrain sharper. Mercy picked her steps carefully over loose shale and stone, and Takana rode in silence behind him, one hand still cradling her wounded side. She hadn't spoken much since the standoff. Elijah didn't press. What they'd escaped had only bought them time, not safety. And the real danger, the one with Takana's blood in his eyes, was still somewhere out there. "Kalen won't stop," she said at last, voice low, as if reading his thoughts. "He'll follow the signs. He'll find us." "Let him," Elijah replied, eyes fixed on the narrow trail. "We're not running anymore." They rode until sunset, then again through part of the night. The moon carved silver edges into the rocks, giving the land a kind of haunted beauty. Elijah moved by memory and instinct, guided by landmarks Takana described in quiet, confident tones. She knew this land, not with the mind, but with the blood. On the third morning, as a hawk circled high above, they reached a narrow pass barely wide enough for a single horse. Beyond it, the trail dipped into a hidden valley, a place so green and lush it looked stolen from a dream. Water glistened down red cliffs in thin ribbons. Cottonwoods danced beside a winding stream. Wickiups, traditional Apache dwellings, rose like part of the earth itself, camouflaged beneath trees. They had arrived. But the welcome wasn't warm. As they crossed the outer ridge, a sharp whistle cut the air. Then came movement. 5 riders emerging from the rocks, bows drawn, rifles at the ready. Faces painted, eyes hard. Elijah raised one hand slowly. "We're not here to fight." One of the riders, a man with a long braid and a jagged scar across his chin, called out something in Apache. Takana answered before Elijah could react, her voice firm. The riders pulled up short. Their leader dismounted and approached, brow furrowed. "Takana?" he asked in accented English. She nodded, and something in his face broke. "Your father lives," he said. "He feared you were lost." Takana slid from the saddle, knees trembling. Elijah caught her before she fell. The warrior barked an order, and another rider came forward to help. They guided them down into the valley, where more faces emerged, Women, elders, children, all staring in stunned silence. Some gasped at the sight of Takana. Others froze at the sight of Elijah. By the time they reached the center of the village, a small crowd had gathered, murmurs rippling like wind through dry grass. Then a voice, deep and unmistakable, called out from within one of the larger wick-ups. It was Toganai. He stepped into the sun, tall and broad-shouldered despite the years. His gray hair hung in braids streaked with white. His face was weathered like old cedar, but his eyes, dark, sharp, held the weight of kings. He saw his daughter and went still. Then, without a word, he strode forward and took her in his arms. For a moment, the whole village breathed as one. Then Toganai's gaze shifted to Elijah. A silence settled, heavier than any threat. "You brought her back," the old chief said slowly. Elijah nodded. "Found her half dead in the arroyo. Figured someone ought to give a damn." Toganai studied him, not with gratitude, not yet. "You're white," he said flatly. "Most days," Elijah replied. The chief's expression didn't change. "You will speak with the council tonight," he said, "and until then, do not leave this valley." Elijah gave a tight nod. He'd faced storms, bullets, and ghosts. Now came the hardest part. Being judged not by what he'd done, but by who he was. That night, the council gathered beneath the stars in a circle of firelight and stone. Elders, warriors, women of wisdom, all cloaked in the silence of judgment. Elijah sat apart from Takana, watched by a dozen eyes that saw him not as a man, but as a symbol of everything they had lost. Toganai stood, staff in hand, his voice deep and steady. "My daughter lives. She was brought home by a man not of our blood, not of our pain. But she says he is not our enemy, that he saved her, that he bled for her." He turned to Elijah. "But words are not enough. We have been lied to before. We have buried too many who trusted the wrong skin." From the shadows, a new voice cut through the night like a knife. "He is a spy." All heads turned. A young man stepped forward, his hair bound tight, his face lined with paint. His eyes burned with something more than suspicion, ambition. Elijah had never seen him before, but he knew instantly who it was. Kylan, Takana's cousin, the one who had left her for dead. "He brings her back so he can learn our trails, our numbers, our weaknesses," Kylan said, circling the fire like a predator. "And you all welcome him like a brother?" He spat into the dirt. "My warriors found signs of soldiers near the western ridge. We are watched, we are hunted, and you think it is coincidence?" Takana stood. "Kylan, you speak of peace," he snapped, "but you brought a viper into our house." Toganai raised a hand, silencing them both. "Enough. There is a way to settle this." He turned to Elijah. "You will fight. Not with guns, not with tricks. You will face one of our own in the circle. And if your heart is false, the spirits will not protect you." Kylan stepped forward, a smirk twisting his lips. "Let it be me." Toganai paused, then nodded. "The challenge is set." The circle cleared. Torches flared. The air pulsed with anticipation. Elijah stood slowly. He'd faced men before, drunks in bars, cattle thieves with shaking hands. But this was different. This was no brawl. It was a reckoning. Kylan stripped off his tunic, revealing a body marked by scars and ritual tattoos. A knife gleamed in his hand, curved, ceremonial. He rolled his neck, flexed his fingers. Elijah pulled his coat off and took the offered blade. It felt too light, foreign. Takana stepped to him, placed her hand briefly on his shoulder.
Don't fight like a white man. Don't fight to kill. Fight to be seen." Then she stepped back. The drumming began, soft, steady like a heartbeat. Kylan moved first, fast, a flash of steel toward Elijah's ribs. Elijah sidestepped, barely. The blade grazed his shirt. He felt the sting. Again, Kylan struck. Elijah blocked, stumbled, recovered. He wasn't trained for this, not like Kylan, not for ritual combat under watching eyes. But he had grit and pain and something deeper. Nothing left to prove except who he truly was. He let Kylan come close, feinting a retreat. Then, at the last moment, he twisted, dropped to one knee, and drove his shoulder into Kylan's gut. The younger man toppled, sand flew. They grappled, hands clawing, knives flashing. Elijah's blade tore across Kylan's forearm. Blood spilled. Kylan screamed, drove his elbow into Elijah's temple. The world spun. Elijah hit the dirt. Kylan lunged, knife raised. But Elijah, half-blind and running on instinct, rolled, caught Kylan's wrist, and turned the blade aside. He didn't strike, didn't kill. He simply stood, panting, bleeding, knife lowered, and waited. The fire crackled. The drumming stopped. Toganai rose. "Enough," he said. Elijah had passed the test, not by winning, but by not needing to. Silence stretched over the circle like a tight wire. Elijah stood, chest heaving, blood running from a gash at his brow. Kylan knelt in the dirt, his pride cut deeper than his wounds. The torches flickered, casting long, dancing shadows across stone and flesh. Every eye was on Toganai now. The chief approached slowly, each step grounded in weight and wisdom. He stopped between the two men and looked not at his daughter, not at his tribe, but directly at Elijah. "You did not strike when you could have." Elijah wiped blood from his cheek. "Didn't come here to kill anyone." Toganai nodded once. Then his gaze turned to Kylan. "You demanded this trial. You accused. You sought blood."
Why? Kylan rose unsteadily, his pride still burning. "Because he doesn't belong. Because we are watched. We are hunted. And she," he jabbed a finger toward Takana, "brings him here like a savior." Takana stepped forward, fury tightening her voice. "You left me to die, shot from behind by our own. Who else knew we'd be at the Red Pass?" Kylan flinched. "Who else sent riders to circle the old trail before sunset?" she pressed. "You said you searched for me, but you never did." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Toganai's eyes narrowed. "You said you rode south, that your scouts found only blood and broken arrows." Kylan straightened, defiant. "Because that's all I saw." But another voice spoke up, quiet but steady. It came from the edge of the crowd. An older warrior, one of Toganai's personal guards. His name was Naveo, a man who rarely spoke unless the wind itself demanded it. "I rode with Kylan that day," he said. "He ordered us to take the upper ridge, told us Takana would be safe." Everyone turned to him. "But later," Naveo continued, "he gave different orders to a shadow group. Apache bows, poisoned tips. He said it was a test of loyalty." A heavy silence fell. Toganai's shoulders stiffened. "You're certain?" Naveo nodded. "I saw him meet with those riders. I saw him hand over the leather pouch of death." Kylan's face drained of color. "You lie!" Naveo stepped forward, hand on blade. "I do not lie in the land of our fathers." Gasps broke from the onlookers. Toganai's voice dropped to steel. "You tried to kill your own blood for power?" Kalen backed away, breath sharp. "I did it for the tribe, for strength. You've grown weak, Father. You seek peace with ghosts while the world sharpens knives behind your back." "But peace was never your enemy," Toganai said. "Truth was." Guards moved in. Kalen fought, wild and desperate, but Naveo moved faster. A single strike to the gut dropped the traitor to his knees. Takana walked up to him, unblinking. "You could have led beside me," she said. "Instead, you chose to walk alone." Kalen looked up, hate and regret a twisted blend. "He'll never be one of us." Takana replied, calm and final. "He doesn't need to be. He's already more Apache in heart than you ever were." Toganai raised his hand. "Take him away. Let the ancestors decide what remains of his name." As Kalen was dragged into the shadows, the firelight flickered back toward Elijah. Toganai stepped toward him once more. "You came not for reward, not for favor, but for her." Elijah nodded. "Then tonight," Toganai said, loud enough for all to hear, "you may sleep beneath our stars without fear, for the land has seen your truth." Takana moved beside Elijah, and for the first time since Clara died, someone reached for his hand, not to pull him away, but to remind him. He wasn't alone anymore. The celebration that night was subdued, not the kind marked by drums or song, but by the quiet weight of justice served. The people of the valley lit fires in silent honor. Toganai retreated to his dwelling. Naveo stood watch. Takana stayed close to Elijah, saying little but holding his gaze whenever doubt crept into his eyes. But peace, Elijah knew, was never permanent in these lands, and before dawn it shattered. The first sign came as a whistle, sharp, unnatural, cutting across the cliffs like a warning arrow. Then came hoofbeats, dozens of them, fast, purposeful. Elijah was already moving before the lookout cried out, "Riders from the south!" He threw on his coat and belt, grabbed his Winchester, and rushed toward the outer ridge. Takana followed, already armed with a bow and short blade. Atop the ridge they saw them, a posse of 30 riders, half in rough militia garb, half in Union blues stripped of rank, likely mercenaries bought by fear or gold.
At the front rode Marshal Royce Benton, a man Elijah hadn't seen in 10 years, since the days he still wore a badge and believed the world could be tamed. Now Benton looked like a hound long off the leash, gray-streaked, sharp-eyed, and drunk on authority. He raised a bullhorn. "Turn over the girl named Takana and the man harboring her. No one else needs to die." Toganai stood at the ridge now, arms folded. "This is sovereign land. You have no right here." Benton sneered. "You lost that sovereignty when your people started shooting at surveyors. We've got bodies, witnesses, and we're done negotiating with savages." Elijah stepped forward. "This isn't about law, Royce. You're cleaning up Kylan's mess for him." Benton's eyes locked on him. "Creed, I figured it was you. I'm not running this time." Benton's smile was all wolf. "Neither am I." He raised his hand. The first shot cracked through the morning air. The battle began. Arrows flew from the cliffs, catching 2 riders before they could dismount. The Apache fought with precision, quiet, lethal. But the militia had numbers and rifles. They pushed forward, forcing the defenders back. Elijah fired from behind a rock shelf, covering Takana as she sprinted to flank the attackers. She moved like wind over stone, silent, certain. Then, screams. Benton's men had set fire to one of the lower shelters, hoping to flush out women and children. Smoke curled upward. Takana turned back. Elijah saw the fire in her eyes. "No," she said, "not again."
She sprinted down the ridge. Elijah followed without hesitation. They reached the burning shelter together. Inside, an elder woman struggled to drag 2 children out. Elijah dropped his rifle, rushed in, and lifted the beam trapping her. The roof groaned. Takana pulled the children to safety. Elijah barely made it out before the shelter collapsed behind him in a wave of smoke and sparks. Benton rode closer, pistol raised.
"You're making this worse, Creed!" Elijah picked up his rifle again. "Maybe, but I'll die facing it." Just as Benton aimed, a war horn sounded from the cliffs above. A second wave of Apache warriors appeared, men Takana had summoned by signal fire an hour earlier, now descending like thunder. The tide turned. Benton saw it too late. An arrow pierced his thigh. He dropped the bullhorn. Another slammed into his shoulder. He fell from his horse, groaning in the dust. His men scattered, morale broken. By midday, the valley was quiet again. Takana stood over Benton, but did not strike. Instead, she turned to Elijah. "You brought me home. Now what will you do?" Elijah looked to the smoldering ruins, then to the peaks beyond. "I'm tired of running," he said, "but I ain't ready to belong." Takana nodded, as if she already knew. And that's when Toganai approached, holding a carved wooden token. An eagle with 2 wings split across 2 lands. "Wherever you ride, Elijah Creed," the old chief said, "this will protect you. Not because you are one of us, but because you chose to be." The valley breathed again. After the smoke cleared and the wounded were tended, the people gathered, not to mourn, but to witness. Takana stood at the center of the village, flanked by Toganai and Navio. The elders formed a half-circle. The younger warriors stood behind them. And in the hush of dawn, Toganai raised his hand. "My daughter has returned from the edge of death," he said, his voice worn but proud. "She has faced betrayal, fire, and doubt, and she did not break. She stood for our people. And she chose peace when war was easier." He turned to Takana, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Today, you are no longer just my daughter. You are my voice, my legacy, my blood reborn." Takana nodded solemnly, then looked to Elijah. "He was not born of this land. He carries wounds we cannot see. But when no one else would stand, he stood beside me. When others turned away, he stayed." Murmurs of assent rippled through the crowd. Then came the offer. Toganai approached Elijah. "You may stay, Elijah Creed. You have a place among us, if you wish it." But Elijah shook his head. "I didn't come to belong," he said quietly. "I came to return what was lost, and now it's found." Instead, he requested a simple valley, north of the sacred ridge, quiet and untouched. A place where no blood had fallen. A place to plant roots without forgetting the ghosts. Takana nodded. "Then it shall be yours, and no warrior will cross it without your welcome." And so, for the first time in 10 years, Elijah Creed chose not to run. He chose where to stay. The next morning, the horses were saddled before the sun had fully broken over the peaks. The valley still slept, wrapped in mist and memory, but a few figures stood in silent farewell. Takana stepped forward, holding a small bundle wrapped in deer hide. Her face was calm, but her eyes shimmered. "I asked the elders," she said, "and they agreed. You deserve this." She unwrapped the bundle and held it out. A new amulet, hand-carved, strung with eagle feathers and turquoise beads. At the center was a wooden eagle, its wings spread wide, but its body split down the middle, one half painted in Apache red, the other left in bare cedar. "A spirit with 2 wings," Takana said, "one in each world."
Elijah took it with both hands, reverent. He traced the carving with a thumb, lips pressing tight against rising emotion. "I don't know what to say," he murmured. Takana smiled faintly. "Then don't say anything." But Elijah did speak, voice low and rough. "I didn't save you for a reward. I saved you because no one saved my boy, and I couldn't bear watching another child die when I could stop it." Takana touched his arm. "You didn't just stop death. You gave me back my name." They stood in stillness. Then Elijah nodded once, deeply, and stepped into the saddle.
He looked down at her one last time. "I'll ride alone," he said, "but I won't be empty anymore." Takana nodded, and as Elijah Creed rode north, he did not look back. But neither of them would ever forget. Elijah Creed didn't ride toward any town. He rode toward the in-between, a land not marked on any map, a place between war and peace, between what was lost and what might still be found. He crossed a shallow creek where deer drank without fear. He passed a canyon where the wind sang through stone, and he remembered his wife's laughter for the first time in years. At dusk, he reached it, a quiet stretch of earth nestled between twin ridges, where wildflowers defied the dust and old trees bent low to shelter the forgotten. He dismounted, removed his coat, and placed the eagle amulet on the branch of a cedar. This was home now, not because he belonged by blood, but because he chose it. And maybe that's the lesson worth carrying. Sometimes the most powerful act isn't fighting back with fists or rifles. Sometimes it's choosing to protect when no one else will, to listen when others hate, to stay when it's easier to leave. Elijah Creed never looked back, not because he had no regrets, but because he finally had something to ride toward. If that moved you, if it reminded you that one person can make a difference, even in the harshest of worlds, then don't just scroll. Subscribe now for more true Wild West stories, tales of grit, grace, and the moments that shaped the soul of the frontier. Because in the end, the West wasn't just built by guns and gold. It was built by choices.